Every once in a blue moon, something that you would never expect to go viral goes viral. And that was recently the case with Piglet's Big Game, a video game based on the movie Piglet's Big Movie. Released all the way back in 2003 to tie in with the movie, this is a children's video game that has garnered attention online for the way that its soundtrack sounds a lot like Resident Evil, and for the way that its gameplay seems to mimic something like Silent Hill, being an adventure horror game but maybe without so much of the Resident Evil violence side. More of the running away and crying that you would maybe do in Silent Hill. And so of course I had to play it, but not just play it, I had to see it all the way through. I had to know what was going on with this game and find out more about it because, and I know I'm not alone on this next part, I've seen tons of videos covering this topic, but things that are intended for children, but that were made by adults that very clearly took inspiration or are referencing things that are not for children, are some of my favorite things like in the world. I'm a huge Courage the Cowardly Dog fan, for example, and growing up and watching that show, there's a lot that goes over your head that watching it as an adult, you recognize as references and homages to stuff. And there's a ton of different children's cartoons and shows that kind of work that way. And I really wanted to know if Piglet's Big Game was like that, but it really isn't. It feels a lot more like they simply took the basic principles of something like a Silent Hill and then made a kid's game that sometimes is really spooky for reasons that maybe aren't clear. It's kind of traumatizing. I think it gets less traumatizing the longer that you play, but I know that if I were, I don't know, 5 years old or 6 years old playing this, I would not have had a good time. I mean, I can be honest, I still have nightmares about the sound from when you die in Yoshi's Story, okay? I think kids are pretty impressionable, or maybe I'm just dumb, who knows. In any case, hi, I'm Mug. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're not new here, welcome back. Today we're gonna dig into Piglet's Big Game, and if you enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like button because that helps it reach farther. It helps more people find it, hopefully enjoy it. And with all of that out of the way, it's time for me to get out of the way and let the star of the show come on in. Piglet's Big Game starts off with some FMVs showing off the overall concept for it. Piglet gets scared by a Granosaurus when he sees that big spooky face. That's the Granosaurus, by the way, and he feels like a failure, so he leaves the 100-acre woods, but then discovers a magic telescope that allows him to enter his friends' dreams and help them out with their different problems as he confronts his fears to become a hero. This is why you get 6 very different levels, each center on one of the different characters, and as for actually playing the game, well, that's a different story. The first thing that you should understand about Piglet's Big Game is that it is indeed a children's game. We shouldn't really judge it by the same rules of other games, and keeping that in mind, I think that from a gameplay perspective, this works really well. It's easy to understand what's going on, with even the most obtuse puzzles becoming a question of re-exploring the game world and trying every item out on everything you can interact with in very classic adventure game fashion. But everything is highlighted and easy to see with these little purple sparkles around it. Talking to characters always has them giving you hints, and the overall controls and combat segments are easy to manage for kids that are maybe still learning how to control games in 3D space. And I'm not starting off mentioning all of this because I'm recommending that parents watching this video rush out and get this now impossible to obtain game for your kids. Seriously, it's sold out on eBay. Twitter really do be moving them sales, huh? I say it because it's really smartly made for kids to approach, but it's also deeply unsettling in many ways. It feels like I'm supposed to find a typewriter ribbon around here right now. Because this is a horror game, even thematically. The main progression through the game is Piglet obtaining new brave faces in order to defeat the scary enemies as he confronts his fears. It makes sense that the game has this atmosphere and overall tone, but it is very often surprisingly dark in ways that seem to be intentional, but not wholly intentional. Sure, there's a dark, creepy atmosphere. There's definitely this sense of baby's first horror game, like you might associate with something like Luigi's Mansion. But there are some details here, whether on purpose or not, that go a bit beyond into some territory that explains why this game stands out. Sure, there's stuff here that makes sense. The use of some pretty strange and purposefully disorienting camera angles that can come off as unsettling, or just the framing of some areas that are very clearly done to make you nervous or afraid of what's lurking off screen, like the first encounter with a heffalump. The ramping tension of the enemy's footsteps, or the overall time pressure that the game incorporates into a lot of puzzles and combat. But then there's stuff like the lack of music throughout a lot of the game, where you'd expect some whimsical track to accompany the adventure. There's nothing. Especially compared to something like Luigi's Mansion, which always has sounds playing, be that musical accompaniment or environmental sounds that still inform of how you should feel. And much like sometimes the scariest monster is the one we can't see, sometimes the scariest sound is silence. There are long stretches of this game where you'll be running around dark environments with fixed camera angles and only the sound of Piglet's footsteps to accompany you, interrupted by a heffalump trumpeting and starting to chase you down. I can only speak from my own experience and my family's, but the atmosphere could easily be seen as boring and not really engaging to some kids due to that silence, or it could potentially scare kids and make them put down the controller or run to get their parents. At least the kids I'm imagining would be what, maybe ages 4 to 7 or so? I don't know, I don't have kids and prefer them as far away as possible, but I do remember being one, and I do remember my cousins being them as well. But let's break down a bit of the game itself. Since you're already here, I think there's some interesting stuff in this game, so let me give you a bit of a tour. I'll be honest, I don't think it's worth really going through the effort of playing this game yourself, so let me do you the service of showing you what's really worth talking about here. The basic structure of the game is to progress through each dream world by obtaining items or talking to characters to continue opening new rooms, solving basic puzzles. Sometimes you have to correctly guess the order of pressing buttons, or you have to move some boxes, or maybe you have to find an item and then use it in the right location. There's a healthy variety of puzzles, and they get progressively harder at what I imagine is a good pace for most kids. Again, I haven't been one in a while, so I can't really say that with any certainty. There's two other main things you'll do throughout the game though, which are collecting cookies and combat. As soon as you start the first stream, which is Winnie the Pooh's, and it's themed around candy, you're shown that pressing the X button will have Piglet kick, and kicking the environment can have objects spit out 5 cookies. And you have to do this. This is not optional. The cookies are the currency to buy the new brave faces, which the game clearly tells you that you need to progress. So the whole idea of kicking objects so they spit out cookies and running around to collect them, and if you don't do it fast enough, you have to kick the object again, and this is something that you need to do. It's not as bad as it might sound, because there's the chill adventure game feel to it, kind of like when you played Pajama Sam or something and clicked on everything on the screen, but it does affect the pacing, because this is maybe a 2.5-hour game at most that feels like it's turned into a 3.5 or 4-hour game just because of the cookie. Here in Candyland, you, or I guess your child, imagine having children in this economy, but alas, you will be introduced to most of what the game has to offer. Even from the start, the lack of music and the empty, almost lifeless, forgotten by time environments present an ominous vibe that clashes with the whimsical, fantastical visuals of a land made of candy. I guess it does kind of suit the whole thing of it being a dream, but it's still kind of creepy. Well, again, it's lifeless except for the constant sound of kicking cookies out of candy. Let that one sink in for a second. So you're running around solving puzzles and kicking stuff for cookies until you encounter the first heffalump. As a note, if you're emulating the game and it crashes after combat, make sure to disable widescreen hacks. Just a friendly tip. Combat has a tiny bit of nuance to it and is actually pretty engaging, as it changes throughout the game. The gist of it is that once an enemy spots you, you can press X to enter a minigame where you have to input different buttons in order to perform a brave face. Depending on the strength of the enemy, you might have to do it multiple times, and once they're defeated, they turn into a little potion. When you're running around the levels with the frequent backtracking as you solve the puzzles, the game will put in new enemies in different configurations. There's a good amount of different heffalumps and woozles, each with their own gimmick and changes of how you fight them, and the most important element of all is timing. All of the combat is on a timer, since the enemy is always moving towards you, but you can always stop fighting and run away from them, and then if you start combat from farther away, even from off-screen, it will make the actual combat sequence have more time available. The final piece of the combat is the brave faces. Each upgraded face increases the complexity of inputs. Not to brag, but I never failed any combat encounters. I mean, I think I'm pretty great at video games, just saying. But even as an adult, I felt that the progression curve here was pretty good. You start with 3 face buttons and they start adding combinations with directions later on, alternating, adding more buttons and more directions until at the end, you need to input 5 buttons with 5 directions. It's still fun since some enemies require you to time the final input with their animations, or they'll hide some of the inputs and you have to guess, or they'll change your inputs as you go. Maybe really young kids might struggle with this, but I definitely appreciated that bit of spice as an adult, and I imagine that it's a pretty decent challenge for maybe the older kids, or maybe 6 or 7. This progression is also found in the levels themselves, by the way, with the first world being very simple, with easy to remember layouts and very few things to do. Predictably, once you give Pooh some honey, all his dream troubles disappear and you'll move on to Roo. Roo's world is this playground of pencil sketches and arts and crafts, and this is where you might put 2 and 2 together, that each world is meant to represent the character and not simply a cool idea for a level. And your objective is to get Roo's ball back. Since Pooh was all about sweets, Roo is all about art and playing, and this is, in my opinion, the only genuinely charming level in the game. Even the audio design and the silence can't sour the kind of genuine playfulness of this environment, with even the paths being drawn onto paper and the trees made of cardboard. It's fun, it's inventive, and it put a smile on my face to look at some of the touches in the environment design. During this level, you'll also play as Tigger. Twice during the game, you'll play as him, and twice you'll play as Pooh. Tigger has stealth sections where you avoid the vision cones of enemies, and Pooh being a kind of kiting simulator as you wrangle the enemies chasing you down. This second level is considerably larger, with more side rooms and more use of items that are far away from each other, and introducing long stretches of backtracking with enemies, as well as better setting the stage of some set-piece combat encounters, which is normally how the game will introduce its new enemies. You enter a room, sometimes it has a puzzle, sometimes the puzzle is simply to beat the enemies, but when you enter these rooms, a new one will pop out and you'll fight them. In this case, it's the bee heffalumps or beefalumps, which are very fast, so you want to get a good distance away from them before beginning the fight. Towards the end of this level, you'll encounter what actually gates your progress through the game, and I mean that literally because it's the strange door. This isn't an actual enemy, it can't hurt you since it can't move. It's only there because to defeat it, you need a certain level of brave face, which again, you unlock by collecting cookies and buying them at the theater stands. This means that while you are allowed to jump into any dream, in reality you have to progress somewhat linearly, and the game flows perfectly if you do. I thought this was really stupid at first because if to beat each level I need a certain amount of cookies and faces, and they're perfectly designed to be done in order, why allow me to go to other levels first, which will be more difficult if I don't have upgraded brave faces, by the way. But then I remembered this is a kid's game, and maybe a kid that gets stuck on puzzles in one world and can't progress will want to go do other stuff elsewhere, collect more obvious cookies in a different dream, and then eventually find the solution to the one they're stuck on. So in that case, it kind of makes sense, but also only kind of, because then they might get frustrated by going to a different dream, progressing, and not understanding why they can't get past the strange door. Honestly, I don't think that there's a good answer to this problem, so I'm just going to move on. But if you've been keeping up with your cookies and you've been buying your brave faces, you defeat the door and you're introduced to the magician woozles, or according to the wiki, the hide-and-seek woozles, which require you to time your final input. If they're not looking when you do the face, they won't take any damage. And after beating 3 of them, you get Roo's ball back. That was his whole thing. He got his ball stuck in a tree. This whole boss fight, though, is kind of creepy, and it does signal a turning point for the game into Creepyville. The woozles here are actually drawn on the floors and walls of the arena, implying that they were drawn by Rue and kind of made up by him, and the whole arena flips over as if this was Inception, and you fight the three of them with the camera zooming in on them menacingly laughing. It's just a tad bit sinister. In any case, as it's pretty clear, you save the day and then you move on to the next two levels, and these are my favorite ones in the game. Next up is Owl, who has lost his photo album and his memories, and also his glasses, but that's another story. But this means this level is themed around the library and memories, with a lot of it being wood to mimic a treehouse. First off, you'll find Pooh imprisoned, and you have to free him, and this leads you to your first Pooh section as you run through the library, running away from the heffalumps. The trippy visuals here start to get out of control though, with pieces of the environment simply floating in the air above a never-ending fall of books, a literal rabbit hole of literature, and there is just a lot more surrealist stuff overall. This chessboard floating above everything with Gopher and a super simple chess puzzle. I don't know, something about this reminded me of Alice. As in Alice in Wonderland, not some person I know named Alice. Why wouldn't I just say Alice in Wonderland from the start? Why would I have to clarify? Why am I leaving this in the script? You do eventually find Owl, and he's terrified because he can't remember things and wants you to recover his memory book, but also, you'll need 2 paintings to open the passage to it. After some more puzzles and exploration, you'll find the paintings and then find Owl's memories, letting him sleep easy. Overall, from the color palette to the surrealist design of some of the things in this level, it's just creepy, like straight up. It's got a haunted mansion vibe all throughout, even since the start when you're outside. The giant books and the tower of literature that falls endlessly, the heffalumps chasing you throughout the library. It's just weird in a way that's kind of cool, but also maybe starting to get close to scaring kids a bit. Because if it were just what you're seeing on screen, it wouldn't be that bothersome. But you have to remember that a lot of the atmosphere in this game is just creepy. Some of this music, that viral Resident Evil style music that we talked about before, is playing underneath all of this. When it isn't, it's just pure silence as you're being chased. All you hear are footsteps. It's really kind of off-putting. But don't worry, the next level is even better, because the next one is Eeyore. And it makes sense that he would have the scariest level given his gloomy disposition. You could even say depression. Eeyore has severe mental health problems. Like, I never thought about it much as a kid, and I'm not a huge Winnie the Pooh fan in general, but man, seeing it now, it's very clear that what Eeyore always needed was either a therapist or a psychiatrist. Unfortunately, we don't have access to one of those, so we're just gonna have to provide him with what we can. This level is set in a graveyard, and then a mausoleum, or a castle or a palace that is under the graveyard. I don't think I get this one quite well enough. It is, again, very surrealist. If somebody knows what this is supposed to be, please let me know in the comments. Thank you. But this level is pretty long and very well designed in my opinion, as well as very creepy. It is my favorite level in the whole game. Which, I mean, it's not a long game, but yeah, whatever. After you explore the graveyard outside, you get to go down and head into this weird castle-like structure with some great camera angles and this whole general theme of somewhere between a mansion of some sort. It really does remind me of Luigi's Mansion, but it has an additional kind of Little Nightmares vibe to it since everything is so big because, you know, you're a piglet and also the enemies are weasels and stuff. And the elephants are really small for what an elephant should be. I got distracted there. The point is that this whole level is really cool. This is where you also get to fight mirror woozles, which twist your screen around, making the directional inputs confusing during combat, and I thought that was fun. But it's just a deeply atmospheric level. There's something from the camera angles to the color usage, the lighting, the darkness, all of it. Shoutouts to this bathroom. I really like video game bathrooms, and this is a really cool one. Can I also just say, Luigi's Mansion 3 is a great game. I really like that game. I like the whole franchise, but 3 is definitely my favorite. Don't know if that's controversial or not. but if you haven't played it, go play it, it's good. My favorite part about this level is the structure of it. It has a central room, and what you have to do is recover the color from Eeyore's dream. And for that, you need to go get the primary colors, each of them in their own little hallway, which means that you're always heading down one of 3 paths and then reconnecting back into the center room, cutting down on backtracking, but keeping every one of the 3 different wings here interesting and thematic. Once you do recover them, you go back to the center room, and this is where you fall down the hole in the center, but you keep falling down the hole over and over again, and you have to fight the tuba or the music heffalump, I guess. It's kind of trippy and off-putting, the whole like jumping down a hole. Again, a little bit of some Alice in Wonderland going on here, but you keep jumping down and fighting them until eventually you just end up back at Eeyore, who's so happy to have color back in his dream. There's some dark stuff here. I remember when I was a kid, I read a lot of Hans Christian Andersen, and I remember stuff like the Matchbook Girl. Children's stories used to be crazy. Maybe they still are. I don't know. In any case, we reach the final 2 levels, which I didn't like much at all. First up is Rabbit's level, which is set in his garden where his carrot factory has gone awry. We have to fiddle with the cogs and machines, talk to Gopher in the cave, run around outside and play as Tigger, go through some garden environments, climb a beanstalk, solve some puzzles, you know, the usual, but it's all kind of bland. You're coming from all of this crazy stuff in Owl and Eeyore's levels, with the only thing I really enjoyed in Rabbit's being the robot enemies, which have this little roulette mechanic that hides some of the inputs during combat. And that was very stressful in a very fun way, since they're also really slow to balance out that you have to guess the input. I could imagine myself as a kid having a ton of fun or a lot of frustration with it. Again, I haven't been a kid in a while. The main problem with this level is that it suffers from the same issue as the final one, and that there's 2 main paths and they're both really long and require backtracking, where Eeyore's level has that central room that splits up the path, making the whole level feel pretty tight, especially during the backtracking. But here it just feels like you'll slowly retread ground, and I think this can also make it very frustrating for kids if they don't know what they're supposed to do, and for an adult that knows what to do, it's just tedious. The final section of Rabbit's level just has you straight up retaking a path for the 3rd time, but just interacting with wooden stakes on the ground to open up a path for Rabbit and his cart. It serves no real purpose, it just feels like padding meant to entertain kids with, "Oh look, Rabbit crashed into the next gate and said a voice line, oh so fun." Or at least I imagined that, but I think kids would also find it annoying. I think I would have. It's just sad that a lot of the eerie horror vibes are also gone by this point given the setting, so I just didn't have that much of a good time anymore. Tigger's level, technically, is the final real level in the game, and it's the longest and also the worst in my opinion. Its theme is just winter in the 100-acre woods, and Tigger wants to paint his house like him. And also there's a fair, but there's so much running around in very long rooms that just go down straight paths that you'll repeat over and over again, but with new enemies. There's just so much reuse of so many rooms. It has the most rooms and the most reuse of them. You're gonna solve puzzles that require you to explore the 2 paths here fully, just to go back to the opposite path, and then in this case you talk with Rabbit, you play an incredibly difficult and tight section with Pooh. I'm sure there's children who cried at this, there is no way this was intended to be easy. And then after you finish these sections, you get to redo it as Piglet, and when you reach the end, you talk to Tigger, you go back to the middle point of the map, just to solve a puzzle, and then you go all the way back to where Tigger is, just so you can get a ticket for the fair. So you go down the entire other path to get to the fair, and then you get a fetch quest where you have to go to 3 reused rooms to fight things in order to solve a puzzle back at where the fair is. And when you go into the haunted house, you fight a boss. You then go back halfway down to the other path just for Roo to tell you that Tigger is in the haunted house that you just left. And then you go back and you fight the final enemies, which are the Sporty Woozles, which they swing their rackets, and when they do, they change one of your inputs. That's it. One of the biggest problems here is that this sort of design, as the game keeps getting bigger and wants you to go on all of these different backtracking adventures, is that you lose the cookie stuff. I'm not arguing that collecting the cookies is something that's very fun and engaging to do, but every time you enter a new room, kicking everything around it to collect all the cookies does keep the game a little bit more entertaining. The problem is that when you've collected all the cookies, you get a cutscene, they tell you that you're done, and now you're gonna go back through this room like 15 times, but there's nothing else to do here. Okay, it's not 15, it's like 3, but you get my point. It just feels like this room is cleared, and it's just something that I sometimes have to run through to go do something else. And after you've already spent so much time, you probably thoroughly explored every corner of the room, you kicked everything you could, and you're just back here again. It's kind of disappointing. At the end of it all, you get Tigger's stripes back so that he has his courage, and now you've solved all the dreams. But we're not done yet. Remember, Piglet is up on some mountain looking at his friends with a telescope. So at this point, you have a couple of options. The game does feature an extra mode, which lets you redo levels, but making them more challenging, but it also has a final level. It turns out that while Piglet was gone, the 100-acre woods gets flooded, and Piglet runs back to the rescue. All of his friends are trapped on little islands because of the flood, and they're trapped with heffalumps and woozles. You have to go solve some little puzzles to get onto each island and take down all of the enemies. At this point, you're fighting every single enemy type from the entire game in a final gauntlet. Once you've saved all of your friends, the Granosaurus appears. That's that scary face. And this time everybody's afraid of it. It's not just Piglet alone. But Piglet is now brave and has all his faces, so he can scare it away, and he saves the day. Yay! Christopher Robin comes in, congratulates Piglet. They throw a picnic to celebrate. Isn't that great? What a great message to kids. If you and your friends are ever attacked by a spectral face of pure darkness haunting you, just make silly faces at it, and you'll be fine. And that would be it. That concludes the crazy adventures of Piglet's Big Game. It's pretty good for a children's game, and it is very much interesting given the circumstances. It does kind of fall into that thing I said at the start. It's a game that's intended for kids, but it's definitely made by adults with a little bit of a wink and a nod. To me at least, it's pretty clear that some of the inspiration here comes from the survival horror genre, be that the fixed camera angles and the way that you solve puzzles, but it's also a kind of clever way of making an adventure game at this point in time. Remember, this is 2003. It was pretty common for a game to be a 3D platformer, and this could have perfectly been one instead. However, it seems they were pretty set on making an adventure game. The PC version of this game is a point-and-click adventure game, and this one kind of is as well. And it makes sense that it follows in that pattern because if you think about it, Resident Evil and Silent Hill, especially early on, are just adventure games that kind of have combat and resource management in the middle, but you're still just collecting items and moving from one place to another to solve puzzles. If it weren't a horror-filled mansion, and if you didn't have weapons with some of the resources for health and ammo, they'd just be adventure games like the classic sort, like the Monkey Island style. So of course, if you wanted to make a game for kids that's a more modern adventure game, you're gonna follow that template. It just so happens that a lot of the fixed camera angles and the theme of the game, being afraid of everything and facing your fears, combined with this very not subtle audio design. You can't tell me that there was no inspiration from Resident Evil for some of this soundtrack. Come on guys, you've heard it multiple times throughout the video, let's be honest here. Means that it ends up kind of being a survival horror game for kids, except the survival part, so I guess it's just a horror adventure game for kids. It is indeed baby's first Silent Hill in a way, but I'm pretty sure that if I were a kid, I would have never noticed. I would have just been incredibly creeped out by certain sections of the game and moved on. Now, whenever I finish a retrospective like this, which I guess does classify, I guess it's going in that playlist, I like to tell you if it's worth going back and playing the game. And I already told you at the start, I don't think that this game is worth going back and playing, and if you have a kid, I don't know, have them play Minecraft or something like that. There's better kids games today. I don't really think there's a reason for anybody in their right mind to play this game now unless you're a YouTuber covering it for history's sake, I guess. You're trying to meme on it and joke on the fact that it went viral. Which, while yes, is the main reason I did this video, the objective of it is to kind of preserve some of the information of this game for posterity. And that is indeed worth doing. This is a very interesting game. It falls into a very strange category. Like, this game came out the same year as Battle for Bikini Bottom. I was definitely not into Winnie the Pooh, but I do think that it's worth talking about in the context of it's just a really strange game. It's obviously something that's made with quality and that fills its purpose as a children's game, but it's just this weird oddity of also being kind of unsettling, but in a way that you can't pin down on like a lack of budget. A lot of this game feels very well produced and with plenty of detail and care and love put into pretty much every single scene, every single room here. So I would find it odd if there is no background music because there was no budget. And while that very well could be the case, I think that there's also just a good chance that they wanted the game to be creepy and to follow that theme. So here we are. And before we go, I do want to mention a couple of things about the development of this game. The publisher Gotham Games existed for only 1 year, and they published a ton of different games, including a lot of licensed games during that 1 year. But more interesting than that is the studio behind it, which is Doki Denki. They existed from 1998 to 2003, and you can tell from their resume that they worked mostly on kids' games. They made the Smurfs and Tigger's Honey Hunt, and then Disney Pooh's Party Game, and a Peter Pan game, and finally Piglet's Big Game. But the last one that they ever made is actually Kaya Dark Lineage. This is a PS2 3D platformer that has some really interesting original ideas and a really cool aesthetic and world that I remember loving as a kid. I remember being hyped up for it from reading previews in magazines, and in my opinion, it did not disappoint. I really like Kaya Dark Lineage, and I think it's underrated. It was at the time, and probably something to rediscover today. So if I can hope for one thing from the surprise success of Piglet's Big Game, it's that more people go and play Kaya Dark Lineage. Maybe that's something that I should do for the channel even. A video on that might be really cool. Anyways, back to Piglet. Overall, it's a really cool piece of history, and I'm glad that I dedicated an afternoon to the game and that I'm here to document it. I hope you like this video. I hope it made you think or something like that, because it's a fun thing. It's a fun curiosity in the universe of video games. And if you did enjoy the video, remember to hit the like button. Helps the video reach more people. Hopefully it's something that entertains them as well. And if you want more from me, including news, reviews, and retrospectives just like this one, make sure to subscribe. It helps the channel out, helps it grow, all the usual goodness. An extra special thanks to my patrons up on the $1 patron wall. It's called that way because there's only one tier, $1. But they support me in everything I do, and I'm incredibly thankful for that. There's so many of you, it's actually kind of hard to believe. And if you want to help me fulfill my dreams, make sure to check it out using the link in the description below. I hope you had a great time though. I hope you go out there and enjoy some great video games, and I thank you all for your support. Also, make sure to leave a comment. That's always fun. I like reading comments, so don't worry, I read all of them. And as always, I will see you again very soon.